The greatest trick the modern financial system ever played was convincing you that the numbers on your screen represent wealth you actually own. In reality, every dollar you deposit is a legal transfer of ownership, an unsecured loan you've granted to a private corporation that bets your future against the speculative machinery of the market. You are not a customer. You are a line item in a capital structure designed to prioritize the survival of the institution over the preservation of the individual. This is the hidden fragility of the digital age, where the difference between solvency and ruin is often nothing more than a software protocol or a locked gate. To understand the structural illusion of safety that you are likely participating in right now, we must first look at the moment the ledger collapsed for a man who believed the promises of the system until the very second they were revoked. The catastrophe that erased the life of Elias was not a malfunction of the financial system. It was the system operating exactly as it was designed. To understand why those iron gates remained shut, we must first dismantle the primary myth of the modern era. This is the belief that a bank deposit is an asset you own. It is not. Legally and structurally, a bank deposit is an unsecured loan you have granted to a private corporation. You are a creditor. In the hierarchy of liquidation, you are often the last to be paid. This is what economists call fractional reserve banking. It is a mechanism where the institution keeps only a small percentage of your cash on hand and lends the rest into the void of the market. When the collective confidence in that ledger vanishes, the physical money is simply not there. It does not exist. Think about what that means. This is usually presented as a series of unfortunate accidents or a sequence of panics driven by irrational fear. But there is a different lens through which to view these collapses. This is the invisible architecture of solvency. While the general public is conditioned to seek safety within the walls of traditional institutions, a parallel set of protocols exists. These are not secret societies. They are structural decoupling strategies used by those who understand that institutional trust is a variable rather than a constant. We are going to examine 5 specific anti-fragile strategies that allowed a small group of individuals to thrive while Elias stood in the sleet. We will look at how James Cash Penney saved 30,000 jobs by using a private contract that the banking system could not touch. We will analyze how the revaluation of physical gold created a 69% increase in purchasing power for those who held it outside the digital ledger. This is not a theoretical exercise. This is a forensic reconstruction of survival. Let me be precise about the mechanics of how this architecture is built and why its primary function is to decouple your value from the fragility of the crowd. Here is exactly how it works. To understand why the iron gates remained shut for Elias, you must first understand the structural mechanics of what you call a bank account. When you hand currency to a teller, you are not placing it in a safe. You are executing a transfer of ownership. Legally, the money is no longer yours. It is an asset of the bank and a liability on their ledger. This is the foundation of fractional reserve banking. Here is what that means in physical terms. For every $100 Elias deposited, the institution was legally permitted to keep as little as $10 in the vault while lending the remaining $90 into the speculative machinery of the market. Think of it as a network of interconnected bets, where the house assumes that not everyone will ask for their chips at the same time. The bank operates on a principle of staggered access, betting that your need for liquidity, which simply means the ability to convert an asset into cash quickly, will never coincide with the needs of the rest of the crowd. This creates a system dependent on exactly 4 structural variables: the stability of the borrower, the integrity of the ledger, the velocity of the crowd, and the physical presence of the reserve. If one of these pillars fractures, the entire architecture of solvency dissolves into a hollow accounting entry. This is not a malfunction. It is a business model built on what economists call duration mismatch. This means the bank has promised you immediate access to funds that they have tied up in long-term mortgages and industrial loans. They have sold you a promise of availability while placing your value in a state of permanent transit. Think about what that means. When Elias looked at his blue book, he saw his labor. When the bank looked at that same number, they saw a debt they hoped they would never have to settle in full. Now you might say that the modern world has solved this. We have government guarantees and regulatory firewalls. That is true, and we will examine exactly what those protections provide and where they fail. But first, we must look at the specific strategies used by those who recognize that a government guarantee is only as strong as the currency it is printed on. We must examine the moment when the most stable asset in history was transformed from a tool of safety into a target for the state. The transition from institutional trust to state intervention happened in a series of calculated shocks. Between 1929 and 1933, approximately 9,000 banks in the United States alone ceased to exist. This was not a slow decay. It was a rapid sequence of structural collapses that erased $7 billion in deposits. Think about what that means. Elias and his blue book were part of a mass of 400,000 depositors at the Bank of United States who woke up on December 11, 1930, to find $200 million of their collective labor had been deleted from reality. In the coal fields of Pennsylvania, miners who had saved for decades found their local credit unions shuttered with nothing but a padlock. In the Midwest, farmers watched as the institutions that held their mortgages and their savings dissolved simultaneously. For these individuals, the ledger was not a theoretical concept. It was the difference between a roof and the road. This was the moment the public learned a devastating legal truth. Failure was unthinkable until it happened. But the most significant target was not the bank account. It was the physical asset that stood outside the ledger. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. This was the moment the most stable asset in history was transformed from a tool of safety into a target for the state. Every citizen was ordered to deliver their gold to the Federal Reserve under threat of 10 years in prison. The government then revalued that gold from $20 to $35 per ounce. Those who obeyed were left with paper, while the gold they once held gained 69% in purchasing power overnight. To restore confidence, the government introduced the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and a suite of new regulations. This created the appearance of a permanent flaw beneath the banking system. The public was told that the era of the locked iron gate was over. They were told that their money was finally safe behind a wall of federal guarantees. It felt like a solution. It felt like the end of the risk. But as we will examine next, this new architecture did not remove the fragility. It merely moved the exit door. Now you might say that the world of 1930 is a relic of the past. You might point to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the massive regulatory frameworks of the modern era, and the trillion-dollar backstops provided by central banks. You might believe that the iron gate Elias faced is a historical curiosity because today the government stands behind every dollar in your account. That is a reasonable conclusion. In fact, it is the exact conclusion the system requires you to reach in order to maintain the velocity of capital. The perception of safety is the fuel that allows the fractional reserve engine to run. But let us examine the structural integrity of that promise with forensic precision. The FDIC insurance fund is not a bottomless vault of currency. It is a pool of capital designed to handle isolated failures, not systemic contagion. As of the most recent reporting periods, the reserve ratio of the Deposit Insurance Fund to total insured deposits typically hovers at approximately 1.1%. This is not a secret. It is a documented accounting metric. It means that for every $100 the government promises to protect, there is approximately $1.10 physically held in the insurance pool. Think about what that means. The solution of government insurance is not a guarantee of physical wealth preservation. It is a psychological stabilization mechanism. It functions perfectly as long as the failure is local and contained. But in a systemic event, where multiple major institutions fracture simultaneously, the math of 1.1% collapses. In that scenario, the state faces a binary choice. They can allow the default, which is a total collapse of social order, or they can fulfill the promise by printing the required trillions into existence. This is the moment where the risk is transferred back to you. They may save the nominal number in your account, but they do so by diluting the purchasing power of every dollar you hold. You keep the digits, but you lose the ability to exchange them for goods and services. The iron gate has not been removed. It has been replaced by a hidden mechanism of extraction through currency devaluation. The safety net is actually a net that captures your value and slowly drains it to keep the institutional architecture from falling. Anyone who tells you that a government guarantee removes systemic risk is failing to distinguish between nominal digits and real value. These are not the same thing. They are often opposites. When the system guarantees the digits, it almost always sacrifices the value. This is the structural trap that the economic elite understood in 1929, and they understand it now. They realized that the only way to achieve true solvency was to move beyond the promises of the state and into assets that command value, regardless of the ledger. Now that we have dismantled the illusion of the institutional floor, we must look at the final two strategies used by those who thrive while the crowd waits for a bailout. We must examine how essential intellectual property creates a psychological staple that functions as a private currency. And we must analyze the most counterintuitive strategy of all, the holding of dry powder to acquire the world when it goes on sale. Now that we know what fails, let us see what survives. That was the theory. Here is what happened in practice in March 2023. In the span of 48 hours, the 16th largest bank in the United States, Silicon Valley Bank, ceased to exist. This was not the slow, physical grind of the Bronx in 1930. This was a digital contagion that moved at the speed of a fiber optic cable. On Thursday, depositors attempted to withdraw $42 billion. By Friday morning, the iron gates were shut, not by chains and padlocks, but by a software protocol that disabled the transfer button on a smartphone screen. The velocity had changed, but the structural fracture was identical to the one that destroyed the life of Elias. This is the third occurrence of a pattern that defines the modern era. In 1929, failure was unthinkable until it happened. In 2008, failure was unthinkable until it happened. In 2023, the cycle repeated. Each time, the public is told that the system has been fixed, and each time, the same duration mismatch, the gap between your demand for cash and the bank's long-term bets, reappears. In 2023, the bank had placed its reserves into long-term government bonds. When interest rates rose, the value of those bonds fell. The bank was technically solvent on a spreadsheet, but practically bankrupt in the vault. Think about what that means. The intervention that followed is often described as a rescue. The government announced that all depositors, even those above the insurance limit, would be made whole. But let us be precise about where that capital originates. The state does not create value, it redistributes it. To fulfill the promise of safety, the system must either extract wealth through direct taxation or through the hidden tax of currency devaluation. When the Federal Reserve creates a backstop for failing ledgers, it dilutes the purchasing power of every dollar you have worked to save. The nominal number in your account remains the same, but the energy that number represents is siphoned away to stabilize the architecture. We must also look at the alternative protocol that has already been tested. In 2013, in the nation of Cyprus, the system did not choose devaluation. They chose the bail-in. This is a legal mechanism where the bank's losses are settled by cancelling a percentage of the deposits. If you had 100,000 euros, you woke up with 60,000. The remaining 40,000 were converted into bank stock that was essentially worthless. This is not a theory, this is contract law. Under modern global regulations, the bail-in is the established legal framework for systemic failure. You are an unsecured creditor. The iron gate is still there. It is simply built into the fine print of the account agreement you signed. You are not learning history. You are evaluating the current status of your own labor. The pattern is already in motion, and here is where it gets uncomfortable. There is a single principle that connects the arable land of the Midwest to the private insurance contracts of the retail giants. It is the pattern that separates those who stood in the sleet from those who acquired the world while it was on sale. To understand this principle, we must first dismantle the final and most resilient belief of the modern era. This is the idea that diversification protects you. It does not. If all your assets are tied to the same underlying ledger, you are not diversified. You are merely exposed to the same structural fracture in 5 different ways. This is not conspiracy theory. This is structural analysis. What the elite of the 1930s understood, and what the data reveals now, is the concept of the sovereign reserve. This is the forensic realization that solvency is not a measurement of how much currency you possess. It is a measurement of the degree to which your value is decoupled from third-party counter-risk. This is the invisible architecture of solvency. While the general public is conditioned to seek safety within the walls of traditional institutions, the sovereign reserve is a parallel set of protocols designed to function when those walls collapse. Think about what that means. The primary illusion of our age is the conflation of access with ownership. When you use a digital bank account, you have access. When you hold a physical asset or a senior contractual lien outside the banking system, you have ownership. Access is a privilege granted by the state and the institution. Access can be revoked with a keystroke or a locked gate. Ownership is a structural reality that exists independently of the ledger. Convenience and safety are not the same thing. They are often opposites. The more convenient an asset is to move or spend, the easier it is for a third party to freeze tax or devalue it. We are talking about the formalization of counterparty risk. Every layer of the traditional financial system is a link in a chain of promises. The bank promises you liquidity. The government promises the bank a backstop. The taxpayer promises the government the revenue. But when the chain snaps, the legal hierarchy of liquidation always prioritizes the survival of the institution over the preservation of the individual. This is why the iron gates remained shut for Elias. He was not a client. He was a component of the capital structure of the bank. The 5 strategies we have examined are not merely investments. They are escape hatches built into the architecture of a failing system. They represent the act of stepping off the chain of promises and onto the ground of structural reality. You have been taught that safety is found in numbers on a screen, but the sovereign reserve teaches that true safety is found in assets that command value regardless of who holds the keys to the vault. The layers of the sovereign reserve are now visible to you. The question is no longer whether the system is fragile. The question is how much of your labor is currently locked behind a gate that you do not control. So, what does this mean in practice? The objective of this forensic analysis is to move from a state of institutional dependence to one of structural agency. To do this, you must evaluate the strategies of the sovereign reserve not as a shopping list of products, but as a framework for decoupling. Let us be precise about the trade-offs involved in each layer, because anyone who tells you there is a risk-free exit is selling you a new version of the same illusion. Physical assets like arable land and precious metals offer the highest degree of independence from the digital ledger. They cannot be deleted by a server error or frozen by a bank holiday. However, they carry a significant liquidity drag. You cannot settle a debt instantly with an acre of soil or a bar of gold. Furthermore, they are vulnerable to physical theft or direct state intervention. Holding gold in 1933 was a strategy for preservation, but it required the courage to face a decade in prison. The risk is not removed. It is transformed from a digital threat to a physical one. Contractual assets, such as high reserve insurance or essential intellectual property, provide a different utility. They allow you to remain within the legal system while bypassing the fractional reserve machinery. You are trading the volatility of the bank ledger for the seniority of a private contract. The limitation here is administrative and systemic. These structures often carry high entry costs and depend entirely on the legal integrity of the state. If the rule of law itself fractures the contract, is merely ink on paper. Finally, maintaining an asymmetric cash reserve allows for the acquisition of value when the crowd is forced to sell. But this carries the hidden tax of currency devaluation. By holding dry powder, you are betting that the eventual collapse of asset prices will be more rapid than the decay of the purchasing power of the currency. This is a bet on timing, and timing is a fragile variable. I am not recommending these paths. I am documenting that they have been the primary tools of survival for those who understood the architecture of the gate. Every alternative merely redistributes the pressure. True solvency is not a destination of absolute safety, but a calculated arrangement of exposure. Think about what that means as we look at the final outcome for Elias. Let us return to Elias. It is now 1938. He sits at a small wooden table in a room that smells of cedar and old wool. On the table lies the blue book from the Bank of United States. The ink has faded and the edges are frayed. He never recovered the $4,500. That labor was deleted and it never returned. But Elias is not among the thousands who were swept away by the decade of dust and hunger. He is housed. He is solvent. He is calm. Beside the useless bank book lies a different set of documents. There is a deed to 3 acres of productive soil in New Jersey. There is a private insurance contract with a senior lien on a reserve that the fractional machinery cannot touch. There is a small weight of physical metal that exists outside any digital or paper ledger. Elias did not find a better bank. He found a better architecture. He understood that his survival depended on the forensic realization that there is a fundamental difference between access and ownership. Access is a privilege granted by an institution, and it can be revoked with a single turn of a key. Ownership is a structural reality that exists independently of the debt of another. This is the core of the sovereign reserve. It is the transition from being a component of a bank capital structure to being the architect of your own solvency. Convenience and safety are not the same thing. They are often opposites. If your wealth is easy to move with a thumbprint, it is equally easy for a third party to freeze or devalue. This investigation is not about the past. It is about the specific fractures currently appearing in the global financial plumbing. The iron gates of the Bronx have been replaced by the software protocols of the digital age, but the mechanism of extraction remains identical. This channel exists to study these fractures before they become geological faults. To understand the protocols that the headlines ignore is not an act of speculation, but an act of intellectual self-preservation. If you intend to position yourself before the next gate closes, join this investigation by subscribing. The pattern is already in motion. I am not a financial advisor. I am a documentarian of structural patterns. The evidence is available to anyone willing to look past the illusion of the ledger.